I am continuing my journey through the Dick Tracy comics. I'll link to my previous videos in the description down below, but just to recap briefly. I've done Volume 1. I got that out from my local library. I had to skip Volumes 2 through 12 because those were not available in my area library. So then I came back with Volume 13. Now, Volume 14, again, is unavailable at my library, so here I am with Volume 15. So I am trying to do these in chronological order, but I am having to leave a lot of gaps depending on what's available at my library. There you go. So yes, this is Volume 15, the years 1953 to 1954. Now, in Volume 1, I said that Volume 1 was a bit of a slog, quite frankly. It was pretty boring to read through, but Volume 1 was also still when Chester Gould, the author, was still finding his feet. So that was understandable. Volume 13, by contrast, was peak storytelling. That was really fun to read, really good storytelling, and it was interesting to see how much the author had improved as a storyteller between the initial first comics in Volume 1 and the comics in Volume 13. And I expected that all the subsequent volumes would also be equally as interesting, but I regret to say that Volume 15 actually is, well, I found it a little bit boring. The stories weren't really all that interesting, and what little story there was really stretched pretty thin. The author was milking everything so that stuff that should have gotten resolved fairly quickly just went on and on. And, you know, I guess you can kind of expect this to a certain extent from daily comic strips. He sets up a little bit of tension and then he just milks it for a couple weeks. But when you're sitting here and reading through the volume, it can get a little bit tiresome. And as I was reading this, I thought to myself, that's funny. I really enjoyed Volume 13 a lot. It's surprising that Volume 15 is not as fun to read. I wonder if it's just me. Am I in a different mood? Have my expectations shifted? But then I went back and I read the introduction. Now, I didn't actually read the introduction before reading the stories because there's a spoiler alert right here that advises against reading the introduction too early. So it says, important story elements are revealed in this introduction. Readers may wish to read the strips before this essay. So that's what I did. I read the strips first, and then I came back to the introduction. But the introduction did kind of confirm for me what I had felt when I was reading the strips, namely that this wasn't the best work of Dick Tracy. This seemed to be a step down from the previous volume. And sure enough, it says, the greatest, most creative decade of Dick Tracy, 1942 to 1952, is over. So, I guess we are moving outside of peak Dick Tracy. And yeah, unfortunately, because my library was missing a lot of volumes, I only read one volume that covered this time span. Volume number 3 covered the year 1951 and 1952. And then the rest of this decade, I guess I've missed out on because my library didn't have those volumes. Except, as I've mentioned in previous videos, when I was younger, I did have some other collections, like the Celebrated Casebook of Dick Tracy, etc., which did have some of those classic stories from the 1940s. So I've read them once before, some of them, and who knows, maybe some point in the future I may be able to track down some of those volumes or some of those stories again. But at least for the present, looks like I've missed out on most of the most creative decade of Dick Tracy, and I am in the nonetheless period. And the introduction goes on to highlight some of the interesting things from this volume, and I may talk about some of the things I learned from the introduction as I go through these stories. And then it closes out here with, still, there is a sense that Gould, that's the author, is repeating himself, even spinning his wheels at times. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of how I felt in this volume. He was spinning his wheels a little bit. Never fear. Some of Dick Tracy's greatest cases are still to come. So I guess there is hope for the future volumes, that there will be some interesting cases yet to come. But this volume was, yeah, it was okay, but it wasn't great. So it starts out, as these volumes do, in the middle of a story. Now, I don't know why this particular reprint line has to start out in the middle of a story. I think at this point in Dick Tracy's history, the individual stories are pretty clearly delineated, so you could just make a volume a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller so that it would start out at the beginning of a story. I don't know, maybe they're assuming a readership that's completist, that all the readers of this volume will have already read the previous volume. But anyways, we are starting off in the middle of a previous story where Dick Tracy is tracking down a villain who has some sort of radioactive poison, and the villain has abandoned his daughter, who also has radiation poisoning. And the daughter is in the sick bed, and they've got to get a doctor from, I believe it's, Switzerland, to come and save her. So, and again, they are milking this. So there's several panels before the doctor is finally persuaded to come. And then once the doctor is finally persuaded to come, then we've got several panels of her just being in the sick bed, etc. Now, this character, I guess she becomes known as Little Wingy, is later abandoned by her father. Or I guess has at this point already been abandoned by her father, and so gets adopted by the B.O. Plenty family. So B.O. Plenty and, what is the name of this character? Gertrude something and Sparkle Plenty, and becomes the little sister here of Sparkle Plenty. So as was mentioned in the introduction to this volume, apparently Sparkle Plenty, when she was first introduced, was a very popular character and a successful marketing spin-off. So there were a lot of Sparkle Plenty dolls or Sparkle Plenty dolls or Sparkle Plenty toys that sold well at the time. And so the author, Chester Gould, was looking to recreate that success. In the previous volume that I reviewed, it also talked about trying to recreate that success with Bonnie Braids, who was the daughter of Dick Tracy and Tess Trueheart. And let me see if I can find a picture of her, because they bring her along as well. They have all three girls playing together at one point. I don't see a picture. It was somewhere here in these early strips. Anyways, so yeah, the Bonnie Braids character also did not recreate the success of Sparkle Plenty merchandise, apparently. So Little Wingy was the next attempt to recreate that magic, and this one also failed to connect with the public as much. But now we have another little girl character in the Dick Tracy comics. Now, her father meets a rather violent end, as is so commonly the case with Dick Tracy villains. Tries to shoot Dick Tracy, but the bullet ricochets off the bulletproof glass. And, yeah, there he is there. So, yeah, the father dies. The daughter is adopted. And then we move into the next storyline, where B.O. Plenty's brother, Kincaid, whose name keeps getting mispronounced by Canhead. So B.O. Plenty mispronouncing names is one of his comic traits. Arrives, and Kincaid is really rich and offers to build a bathroom for B.O. Plenty and his family. And that episode gets drawn out for several days. But then we find out that Kincaid has a bit of a sordid past, or at least so it appears, because he is being blackmailed by one of his ex-wives over a murder that apparently happened years ago. So this is getting interesting. But then, again, this whole thing just gets dragged out needlessly. But it is not without some of its punches. There are a few shocking moments. So, despite things moving at a slow pace, this strip still does have the ability to shock, because there are a number of innocent bystanders that the author Chester Gould is willing to kill off quite suddenly. So, in a way that is shocking to the reader, or at least is shocking to me. So, yeah, they're attempting to murder Kincaid. And, oh yeah. First, though, let me get to one of the slow parts. They have this poison ant scheme where they're going to get Wingy and Sparkle Plenty infected with this poison ants and get them in the hospital bed. So, now, if you were reading these when they came out daily in the newspapers, maybe it would have been a little bit more tolerable, because this would have been, I don't know what, half a year after the previous episode. But when you're reading them collected in one volume, it gets a little bit tiresome, because you feel like, we just got done with Wingy being in the hospital bed, being sick. But now we have to do this all over again with the girls once again being in the hospital bed, being sick. So, yeah, he's really coming back to this well very frequently about the little girls being in danger. So, okay, that's a little bit tiresome. But, yeah, let me flip ahead here. Kincaid is left to die with explosives strapped to his vest, which are strapped to a timer. Obviously not the most efficient way to kill somebody, but the Dick Tracy comic strips are full of these little simmering death traps. So, you know, you just have to put up with them if you're going to read Dick Tracy. That's how the stories operate. But a society woman finds the bomb victim and agrees to help the police. And, you know, she's young, good-looking, innocent. You think she's going to be okay, but she gets murdered callously by the bad guys. And again, this kind of thing is... I was not expecting her to get murdered like this. It's shocking to the reader. And the bad guys murder a few other innocent bystanders before they're caught. So, yeah, that kind of thing, those kind of shocks keep the interest up as you're reading these. But there is a lot of boringness in between those. Okay. Yeah, the girls do eventually get better. And they get the bathroom built. And then, yeah, we're still going on with this storyline. Yeah, somewhat surprisingly, at least I thought it was surprisingly, they do not meet a gruesome end. He almost does. A lot of the Dick Tracy villains meet a gruesome end, but they end up saving him. He falls from a large building, but the police have a mattress there to save him. And I kept expecting him to attempt a jailbreak or something and get shot attempting a jailbreak. But he doesn't. They keep him in jail. And, oh yeah. Here's that picture I was looking for earlier. So this is all three of the girls together. Bonnie Braids, Sparkle Plenty, and Little Wingy. Again, apparently Sparkle Plenty was very merchandisable when she was first created. Little Wingy and Bonnie Braids were subsequent attempts to recreate that gold mine, which didn't connect with the readers in quite the same way. But there you go. All right. There is, yeah. Sorry, I was flipping past it, but maybe this is worth commenting on. So, after the bad guys are arrested, there are several pages of trying to find out exactly what happened with that murder many years ago, and finding the murder weapon, which got thrown away in the quarry, which is not interesting, and which goes on for many pages and many panels before... Yeah, look at how long this goes on for. I guess there's a little bit of break for Christmas. And they're still looking for the murder weapon in the quarry. Still looking for it. They really milk this for a long time. Gets a little bit tiresome to read. Oh, there's an interesting little note here where I guess at this point in history... somewhere around 1953, the source strip that they're using for this edition changes. So in the last several volumes and running through 1953 dailies, we've used the syndicate proofs from Chicago Tribune, which are in a wider yet shorter format. From here on, we revert to the taller versions as our best quality source material. So a little interesting behind-the-scenes commentary there. I guess there's some issue with finding the best source material after all these years. Apparently, maybe a lot of the available source material has deteriorated over the years. But yeah, it's a noticeable change. And it's a change which is a little bit drawing, because you can see maybe how crisp and clear these lines are here. To go to versions where the lines look a little bit more smudged, and where it looks like maybe these strips aren't quite as clear art. But anyways, once they get the gun, then they grill the killers to finally get the confession. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking for something here. Yeah, so Dick Tracy has a bit of a vindictive streak in him. And I don't know if this reflects the views of the author, who was, I believe, conservative, kind of tough on crime type political viewpoint. But he gloats about the fact that he's getting evidence to send the criminals to the electric chair. So here we go. Pony's confession plus the overwhelming evidence means but one thing: the electric chair for both of them. So yeah, I'm not sure how realistic this portrayal is. I mean, certainly nowadays, overwhelming evidence would not be a guarantee of the electric chair, right? There would still be the trial, and whether or not they got the death penalty would be open to any number of factors and the discretion of the judge. In the world of Dick Tracy, it seems like once you have the overwhelming evidence, then it's just a sure thing that the electric chair is going to follow. Now, perhaps that's the way things were in the 1950s. You know, perhaps things have changed since then. Or perhaps this is just a comic strip and you shouldn't take it too seriously. But this is one of several spots where Dick Tracy mentions that he is sending these killers to the electric chair. It comes up a few times in these strips, and seems to be quite happy about it. So, yeah. One of the things you notice when you read these strips is that Dick Tracy, in contrast to a lot of superheroes who have this like code that you should never kill, Dick Tracy does not have that code. He's more of a tough lawman. But we actually don't see their conviction, or we don't hear anything more about it. I guess we're just left to assume they got the electric chair, because we then move into our next story, which is a baby hidden in the forest inside a tree. So this is a little bit far-fetched, but I guess after so many years of doing this strip, maybe you start to get a little bit desperate for story ideas. So it's an abandoned baby, or a baby that's being left in the tree as part of a scheme to get an inheritance from a father who will only give an inheritance to her daughter if she produces an offspring. Maybe that the stakes for that weren't high enough, so we throw in her finally killing her father. A little bit of fratricide here to heighten the stakes. Now she's a murderer as well. And then this one simmers for a bit, and again, like all of these, it gets a little bit boring. But eventually, Dick Tracy does crack the crime. So I'm just flipping through the boring parts here. And, yep. Another criminal gets killed by Dick Tracy, who again is not shy at all about using lethal force here. So he ducks the first shot. And then you're entitled to just one miss, Sticks. So then that's the guy out of the duo. He's still got to get the girl, and she goes to her brother-in-law, who is Open Mind Monty, named after because he's got this knife sticking out of his forehead, which apparently he got, And this doc told him, don't ever remove it or you'll die. So he didn't. Although we find out later that actually it's all fake. That it's just a bit of makeup he has on to give himself an air of mystique. But yeah, he gets recruited, and he is going to try to kill Dick Tracy to avenge his brother. But yeah, he misses, and Dick Tracy gets him, although he doesn't have enough evidence to hold him, so the guy gets released. But Dick Tracy gives him a parting jab. He said, "You tried to kill me. I won't forget that, open mind. Next time I see you, I hope you're on a slab." Yeah, just more evidence that Dick Tracy can be a little bit of a cold bastard. Although, as it happens, open mind survives. I guess it's it's evidence that not every Dick Tracy villain meets a violent end. And I guess if you're a storyteller, you want to use your violent ends sparingly, because if everybody gets killed, then it's not shocking anymore, right? You've got to keep the reader guessing a little bit. So, let's see. Flip ahead here a little bit. They shoot down his car, and then he is instructed to lie down on the road, and they actually take him alive. And then that's when Dick Tracy reveals that it actually wasn't a knife stuck in his forehead. It's just a little bit of makeup on a plastic prop. Then, for the first time in I don't know how long, there's no bad guy for a while. These Dick Tracy comics, they usually have one bad guy appear just as soon as the previous bad guy gets caught. But for several panels, there's no bad guy. Dick Tracy is investigating, being shown new technology by, what's his name, Diet Smith, I believe. And then we get into a flood storyline, where once again, the little girls are in danger. This time they are being carried away by the floodwaters. This is the third time in this collection that these little girls are in danger and need to be rescued. Well, I guess if you're going to have little girls in a detective comic, what else are you going to do with them? So they drift away, and then they end up being saved by a blind woman who walks around with her pants being torn at just a very provocative length. There's a good picture. Which, seems a little bit ridiculous, but as was pointed out in the introduction, this was actually quite common in the Little Abner strips at the time. And the artist who drew Little Abner was good pals with the guy who drew Dick Tracy, so I guess they had nods to each other's work quite frequently. I am just about out of time here because this camera stops after 30 minutes. I haven't quite gotten to the end of this collection, but I've almost gotten to the end of it. So I've talked about most of it, and we're just going to have to call it good here. Thank you, BookTube.